Boa tarde, queridos hermanos. Obrigado por este gentil convite. É uma grande honra falar para público tão distinto. Meus irmãos, esta é a extensão de meu português. Ai de mim. First of all, my very sincere thanks to Right Worship Brother Octavio Souza, my dear friend, who made this meeting possible, and he has taken the time and effort to convert my paper from English into Portuguese, both for the presentation as well as the PDF of that. Brethren, this paper was written by me more than a decade ago when I was invited to present a paper at the Masonic Studies Society in London. And that was in the year 2010. And I was the first Indian Mason to be invited to this 100-plus-year-old society. So I deemed it a great honor and privilege. So I wanted to present a paper which was something different from what they had been receiving the previous 100 years. And also to make an academic presentation to suggest that some of the concepts of Masonry were prevalent in ancient India. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that Masonry started in India. I'm just saying that from the Masonic concepts, which we are so used to in Masonry, were prevalent in India. So without any further ado, let me now proceed into the paper. My brethren, this Masonic paper, as I said, is a result of my own personal exploration into some parallels between Masonry and Indian philosophy. I'm well aware that most, if not all of you, have studied not only Western thought, but also explored in your own ways other streams of knowledge emanating from all over the world, including from the land of my birth and infant nurture, India. Members of Masonic study groups like this are naturally keen students of both the origin and history of the craft, as well as its philosophical underpinnings. Many brethren more learned than I have in the past devoted their lives in the search for this knowledge. Many have found something of value. Many have shared their discoveries. I now wish to share with you some of my thoughts. So in this paper, therefore, I propose to present you a very broad outline, tracing some of the parallels in Masonry and Indian philosophy. Brethren, by way of introductory remarks, now one of the many things that any student of Masonic literature and comparative religion learns is a remarkable presence of common factors, common beliefs, common doctrines, common practices, and common symbols in the religions of all races alike, whether ancient or modern, whether Eastern or Western, whether civilized or barbarian, whether Christian or pagan, however separated from others by time or distance, however intellectualized or primitive, and however wide their differences in important respects, each people is found to have employed and are still to be employing ideas, symbols, and practices in common with every other. A close examination of Masonic literature confirms and amplifies this impression. For the student will find that numerous authors connected with the craft have demonstrated that there is a close correspondence to be found in the various apparently unrelated systems, and they have further emphasized how ancient and universal are the ideas, symbols, and practices which are embodied in a modern system of Freemasonry. If one were to persevere with research and reflection, it would become apparent to the student that the universality and uniformity noted by historians are due to the fact that at one time, long, long back in the world's past, there was implanted in the minds of the whole human family, which was then doubtless much more concentrated than at present, a root doctrine in regard to the nature and destiny of the soul of man and its relation to the deity. In all scriptures and cosmologies, the tradition is that of a golden age, an age of comparative innocence, wisdom, and spirituality, in which racial unity and individual happiness and enlightenment prevailed, in which there was that open vision, for want of which it was recorded that the people perished, but in virtue of which man were once in conscious conversation with the unseen worlds, and they were shepherded, taught, and guided by the gods who were disincarnate superintendents of the infant race, who imparted to them such principles, such sure principles, upon which their spiritual welfare and evolution depended. The testimony concerning this golden age is found to have been recorded in all languages, and it is unanimously stated to be the period of the very early beginnings of the human race. In these early days, we learned that the psychic and physical intellect in man was dormant, and we are told that it was on this account that infant humanity was guided and taught under the direct superintendence of divine teachers and instructors. It is of particular significance to Freemasons to find the tradition affirms that it was under the guidance of these instructors that humanity was taught its very first notions of all the arts and sciences, and it was they who laid the foundation stone of those ancient civilizations which so sorely puzzle our modern generation of scholars. This will account for the fact that no matter how far back into the night of time archaeological or other investigations are extended, high stages of civilization are found, each having an elaborate numeric system where, according to modern scientific theories, only the most primitive conditions might have been expected. The presence of fully developed numeric systems in ancient civilizations proves that the science of numbers was not slowly evolved by primitive man by learning to count on his fingers, as is popularly supposed, and confirms the tradition of a fully elaborated system of computation, which was revealed to the priesthood of the early races by the spiritual teachers of mankind. We of today pride ourselves upon being wiser and more advanced than primitive humanity. We assume that our ancestors lived in moral benightedness, out of which we have since gradually emerged into comparative light. All the evidence, however, negatives these suppositions. In fact, it indicates that primitive man, notwithstanding his intellectual undevelopment, according to modern standards, was spiritually conscious and psychically perceptive to a degree undreamt of in our day. It is therefore ourselves, for all our cleverness and intellectual development in temporal matters, are nevertheless plunged in darkness and ignorance about our own nature, the invisible world around us, and the eternal spiritual verities. We may then well inquire how it is that we have departed so far from our original state. And once again, tradition comes to our assistance. The tradition, my brethren, is also universal of the collective soul of the human race, having sustained a fall, a moral declension from its true path of life and evolution, which has had the effect of severing it almost entirely from its creative source, and which, as the ages advanced, has involved its sinking more and more deeply into physical conditions. This has resulted in a splitting up from a unity employing a single language into a diversity of conflicting races and different speeches and degrees of moral advancement, and has been accompanied by a progressive densification of the material body and a corresponding atrophy of the spiritual consciousness. Let me repeat that, my brother. This has led to a progressive densification of the material body and a corresponding atrophy of the spiritual consciousness. The truth then of this fall has been perpetuated in our phenomenal world by the fact that to fall is the property of everything material. Purified spirit alone is capable of ascension, of counteracting the laws of gravitation, which, as shown in the allegory of the flaming sword of the cherubim guarding Eden, rigidly excludes from ascending all that is unfit to inhabit a world more advanced than a physical one. Thus, the initial act in the earthly existence of every seed and germ and egg, of every newborn animal and child, is to fall to the ground. At the very outset of its career, it is therefore rehearses its own form or person, the primal fall of cosmic spirit into the plane of nature, which, while its subsequent function is to rise and grow physically or morally according to its kind. Such, my brethren, is the testimony, the unanimous testimony of the ancient wisdom tradition. And despite its rejection by many in our day, it is my conviction that we cannot adequately apprehend the divine scheme unless we realize that the fall was an incident thereof that was ordained by and that existed primarily in the prescience of the deity. That the descent of spirit and its incarnation in the material world was a process as gradual as has been and is the rise, the emergence of spiritual life from within its present physical limitations. The incarceration of spirit, therefore, in material conditions, involving, as it did and does still, the struggle for emancipation and the knowledge of evil, was and is essential and necessary to enable the spirit of man to become self-conscious of its own inherent perfection and divinity by undergoing an experience which is the antithesis of its own birthright in a plane of existence which is the antipodes of its natural home. Hence, it follows that redemption is a necessary complement of creation. And accordingly, we find that tradition asserts that as a consequence of the fall, it was necessary and within the divine providence that humanity should be redeemed and restored to its former high estate. The restoration in time requiring vast time cycles for its achievement. And it requires something further. It required the application of an orderly and scientific method under skilled direction. And we may reasonably inquire whence would come that skill and scientific knowledge, if not from the divine and now invisible world. From those gods and guardians of the erring race, of whom all the ancient traditions and sacred writings tell. Would not that skilled method be properly described if it were termed, as is in our modern Freemasonry, a heavenly science, a noble science? And would it not be welcomed in the words that Freemasons in fact use as hail royal art, salve art real? Rather, let me talk a little bit about the ancient wisdom tradition. To the spiritual guardians of the primitive man, then we must attribute the communication of that universal science of rebuilding the fallen temple of humanity. And to this source, we must credit the distribution in every land and among every people of the same or equivalent symbols, practices, and doctrines. This was the one religion throughout the entire world, and it laid down the ancient and established usages and customs to be followed at all times by everyone willing to accept its discipline. It was the sacred law for the guidance of fallen humanity, a law valid from time immemorial, or in other words, from the dawn of time till its sunset, and of which it is written, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. This universal science, my brethren, is related to have originated in the East. For the East, in every sense, geographically, astronomically, and spiritually, is ever the source of light. Ex Orient lux, out of the East light. And as humanity itself became diffused and distributed over the globe, to have gradually spread towards the West. The record of this truth is retained in a modern instruction lecture with the cryptic phrase, quote, learning originated in the East and then spread its benign influence towards the West. This, my brethren, is from the fourth section, the first lecture of the Emulation Craft Ritual Lectures. During the process of distribution of humanity, there came about, as I mentioned earlier, that progressive densification of the material body and consequent atrophy of the spiritual perception. On account of this, the influence of the wisdom teaching became correspondingly diminished. Through all its principles remained as valid and effective as ever. To follow the course of its progress in any detail would require a long treatise and is therefore outside the scope of this paper. But it should be noted that despite human vagaries and conceptions, the light, like that of a master mason, has never been wholly extinguished, however dark the age, and according to tradition, the present age is spiritually the darkest of all the dark ages. And among the witnesses to the ancient wisdom is the system which you and I know as Freemasonry, which is a faint and feeble flicker perhaps, but nevertheless a true light and in the true line of succession of the primitive doctrine. The earliest teachings of the mysteries traceable within historic time was in the Orient and in the language known as Sanskrit, a name itself significant and appropriate, for it means holy writ or sanctum scriptum. And for the very great lights of the ancient wisdom, one must still refer to the religious and philosophical scriptures of India, which was in its spiritual and temporal prime when modern Europe was frozen beneath an ice cap. But races of men, like individuals, have their own infancy, manhood, and child and old age. They are but units upon a larger scale than the individual for furthering the general life purposes. When a given race has served or failed in that purpose, the stewardship of the mysteries passes on to other and more effectual hands. The next great torchbearer of the light of the world was Egypt, which after many centuries of spiritual supremacy, in turn became the arid desert that it is now, both spiritually and materially, leaving nevertheless a mass of structural and written relics still testifying to its possession of the doctrine in the days of its glory. From Egypt, as civilizations developed in adjoining countries, minor centers for impacting the knowledge were instituted in Chaldea, Persia, Greece, and Asia Minor. And a record of this diffusion is preserved in the volume of the Sacred Laws in the Old Testament. For the Exodus, the book of Exodus, is in one of its many allusions a witness to the passing of the mysteries from Egypt to new and virgin regions for their enlightenment. Of these various translations, those that concern us chiefly are two, the one to Greece and the other to Palestine. We know from the volumes of Sacred Laws that Moses was an initiate of the Egyptian mysteries and became learned in all its wisdom, while the writings of the Alexandrian philosopher Philo Judaeus, also known as Philo the Jew, inform us that in Egypt Moses became, quote, skilled in music, geometry, arithmetic, hieroglyphics, and the whole circle of the arts and sciences, unquote. In other words, he became, in a real sense, a master mason, and as such qualified himself for a subsequent great task of leadership of the Hebrew people and the formulating of their religious system and the rule of life as laid down in the Pentateuch. The Mosaic system continued, as we know, along the channel indicated in the books of the Old Testament, and then after many centuries, effloresced in the greatest of all expressions of the mysteries as disclosed in the Gospels of the New Testament, or the New Witness, involving the enfoldment, the comprehension, and gathering of the religious past of the whole world, centralized under the supreme grand mastership of him who is called the light of the world, and embodying all the characteristics, legends, and symbols hitherto appertaining to the central figures of preceding dispensations, proclaiming the unity of all human aspiration and formulating in one grand system the doctrines of both the East and the West. Concurrently with the existence of the Hebrew mysteries under the Mosaic dispensation, the great Greek school was developing, which originated with the Orphic religion, culminated and came to the focus at Delphi, and generated the philosophic wisdom associated with Athens in the Periclean Golden Age. Greece was the spiritual descendant of both India and Egypt, and we know that the great initiate, who is accorded the title of Pythagoras, journeyed to India before being received in Egypt to take his final initiation prior to founding the school at Crotona associated with him. Plato also tells us that the aspirants for initiation visited Egypt before promoting spiritual advancement in Greece. Brethren, it will not be possible for me to deal adequately with all the mystery systems in this paper. I shall therefore lead this thread of thought by asserting that modern Freemasonry is the direct and representative descendant of the aforementioned schools of ancient wisdom. I now proceed to a look at the parallels between Masonry and Indian philosophy. Brethren, modern Masonry is carried on according to the European tradition, mostly based on the allegorical explanation of biblical stories. Nevertheless, let us look for some parallels from Indian philosophy. Let us first look at the concept of creator, preserver, and destroyer. To begin with, the word lodge itself, as per one explanation, is supposed to be derived from the Greek word logos, as well as the Sanskrit word loka. The three presiding officers of a lodge, who are the worshipful master, the senior warden, and the junior warden, represent the creative, preservative, and destructive attributes of the Almighty. And according to Brothers Church Ward and Brother J.S.M. Ward, both of them who were once distinguished members of the same Masonic Studies Society in London, according to these two brethren, they represent the Hindu Trinity, so that the worshipful master represents Brahma, the junior warden represents Vishnu, and the senior warden represents Shiva. But in the case of these two brothers, Brother Churchward interchanged the junior warden with Vishnu and the senior warden and junior warden, he interchanged. I believe Brother J.S.M. Ward was more correct, and that I will go with Brother J.S.M. Ward's interpretation. Why, I shall explain to you. The worshipful master opens the lodge, so he figuratively creates the lodge. The junior warden preserves it by calling the brethren from labor to refreshment and from refreshment to labor. And therefore, it's a preservative concept. And then the senior warden closes the lodge, or figuratively closes or ends the world. The three degrees themselves are also degrees of creation, preservation, and destruction, respectively. Now, brother, the very design of the Hindu temple itself demonstrates to the layout adopted many, many centuries later in our Masonic lodges. The main deity in the Hindu temple is always located in the east facing the west, so clearly reflected in the position of the worshipful master in a Masonic temple. The Vahana, or the vehicle of the main deity, is placed in the west, looking towards its lord and master in the east in a Hindu tradition. This is exemplified by the positioning of the senior warden in the Masonic temple. The minor deity in a Hindu temple is located in the south facing the north. This has a clear parallel in the placing of the junior warden in the Masonic temple. The north side in a Hindu temple is invariably kept bare, kept dark. Now, brother, in a lighter vein, doesn't this remind you of the north side of a Masonic temple? Perpetually kept in the dark, and thus probably an appropriate resting place for the hard-working and often ignored Lord Secretary and Treasurer. Rather than this theory is further established by the following considerations. The Vedas are said to have come out of the mouth of Brahma and unfolded on the pedestal before the worshipful master are the volumes of the sacred laws. Brahma is the god of wisdom, and the pillar near the worshipful master represents wisdom. The creative activity of Brahma is further illustrated with the juxtaposition of the square and compasses on the volumes of sacred laws. The compasses represent the male principle and the square the female, and the combination represents the constant creative activity of Brahma. The worshipful master represents the rising sun in the east that creates the day, and this indicates the creative aspect of the worshipful master. The male aspect of the deity is also shown by the Tau cross, or the levels of the worshipful master's apron, and by the gavel in his right hand, which represents the same emblem. The Tau cross is a phallic symbol and stands for the male and creative side of God, as also the gavel. Consequently, the association of the worshipful master with Brahma, the rising sun, creation, otherwise known as Srishti, becomes manifest. Circumambulating, we next reach the junior warden, who represents Vishnu. His deity is his duty is preservation, or calling the brethren from labor to refreshment and from refreshment to labor, thus satisfying their physical needs. This function corresponds to something known as sthiti, which is preservation, and is represented by Vishnu. The junior warden represents the meridian sun, that by its full sunshine gives life and vigor to the world, thus causing preservation. This identity is further demonstrated by the meaning and representation of the password, leading from the first to the second degree, which indicates plenty and is represented by an ear of corn near to a flow or fall of water. These two are emblems of the god of vegetation in primitive times, who after the development of the solar system of religion became the preserver. For preservation consists in the supply of food and water. the peculiar province of the junior warden in the lodge, and of Vishnu in the world. This circumstance is further accentuated by the upright lines of the plum rule, which reminds us of the water that falls from heaven and makes the stalk of corn grow and thus provide food for man. Brother Ward makes a further remarkable observation that this is symbolized by the caste marks of Vishnu, which are 3 plumb lines drawn on the forehead. Brother Ward does identify the junior warden with Vishnu. Proceeding onwards, the senior warden, who represents the setting sun, is a destructive side of God, or Shiva. When his gavel falls, the lodge is closed and all is darkness, just as when the sun sets, darkness sets in. He is associated with the level, which is horizontal lines, the emblem of destruction or the great leveling. As death is the great leveler, so are the senior warden and Shiva connected with death. Brother Ward again remarks that the horizontal lines of the level further correspond to Shiva's caste marks, which are 3 horizontal and parallel lines. Just as Vishnu is associated with water, so is Shiva with fire. The password leading from the 2nd to the 3rd degree, somewhat abstrusely, is said to prove this. Brother Ward explains it as follows. The password refers to the first artificer in metals. He dug the bowels of the earth and converted the ore into metal only by the purifying power of fire. Hence is the association of the password with fire. And fire is the emblem of Shiva in the shape of the 3rd eye on his forehead. The level in its triangular form with the point upwards is the ancient and worldwide symbol of fire and further confirms this view. Of the 3 lesser lights in Freemasonry, the moon is said to correspond to the senior warden, and Shiva is adorned with the moon, thus further emphasizing the identity of the senior warden with Shiva. Dr. Oliver, in his book, The History of Initiations, states that the principal officers who presided in the ancient Hindu mysteries were Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. There's a remarkable identity between the 3 principal officers who rule the lodge and the Hindu deity that rules the world. Now I come to the divine spirit, the soul, and the body. Another symbolism that is stated is that the worshipful master represents the divine spirit, the senior warden represents the soul, and the junior warden represents the body. The question to and the answer from the junior warden shows that man's body is on guard against outside evil influences. The senior warden's reply shows that all assembled have made some spiritual progress and are fit for further advancement. The next 7 questions indicate the 7-fold nature of man and also show that 7 perfect a lodge, this being an astrological reference to our planetary system. The senior deacon stands for intuition, whereby the soul obtains its inspiration from the divine spirit. The junior deacon represents the physical means by which the soul, represented by the senior warden, passes on the inspiration received from the divine spirit, the worshipful master, to the material world. Hence, he represents intelligence and the 5 senses of man. The inner guard represents the power that permits the soul to enter into the flesh at any given moment. For spiritually, the inner guard represents that warning that must be given to those who attempt to probe without caution into the mysteries of God. The Tyler represents the power that keeps off all evil passions and desires that are man's enemies from entering into the holy precincts. Major A. Powell, in his book, The Magic of Freemasonry, deals with the psychological interpretation of the functions of the officers. He says, quote, In Eastern psychological science, a fuller and more complete analysis of the psychological nature of man's being is to be found. Western psychology, though rapidly approaching it, as yet not sufficiently defined to serve unaided, unquote. According to him, the worshipful master represents wisdom or buddhi. The senior warden represents strength or will, which is atma. The junior warden represents beauty or the creative mind, which is higher manas. The senior deacon represents reason or intelligence, which is the lower manas. The junior deacon represents desire or feeling, which is kama. The inner guard represents physical vitality or the brain, which is prana or linga sharira or the etheric double. And the outer guard represents the physical body itself, the sthula sharira. And the immediate past master represents the matured wisdom of experience derived from past acts and built into nature. This is the karuna sharira or the causal body. The worshipful master calls his forces into being, elicits the three principal officers, that is wisdom to guide, will to drive, and mind to conceive. These are, however, static powers that require dynamic forces for transmission of power into acts, for which each has a mobile or dynamic assistant free to move about the floor of the lodge, carrying out the behests of the three chairs. Thus, wisdom, representative of the worshipful master, directs reason, who is the senior deacon. Will, represented by the senior warden, energizes desire, which is the junior deacon. And mind, represented by the junior warden, stimulates the brain, which is the inner guard, which again passes it to the physical body, thus producing action. The second chapter of the Kaushitaki Upanishad opens with this noteworthy passage. I quote from that. The vital breath of prana is Brahma, which is divine spirit, says Kaushitaki. Of this Brahma in the form of the vital breath, the mind is the messenger, the speech, the server, the eye, the guard, and the ear, the gatekeeper. To this Brahma in the form of vital breath, these powers, the senses bring offerings, though he does not ask for them. Unquote. The analogy between this and the officers of the lodge is simply remarkable. The symbolism of the principal officers as representing the divine spirit, soul, and body has already been alluded to. The changes in regard to the relative position of the square and compasses on the master's pedestal are said to further confirm this view. The compasses in the square represent the heaven and earth, and consequently the spirit and the body. In the first degree, the spirit is covered over the body, which predominates in the first stage of human existence. In the second degree, one point is exposed, showing that the spirit as soul is struggling to gain full mastery of the body with the aid of the liberal arts and sciences. And finally, in the third degree, this consummation is reached through the gates of death, by the soul obtaining liberation from the body on its way to union with the divine spirit. Again, the three knots themselves are said to represent the divine spirit, the soul, and the body, and teach the very same lesson. Freemasonry works for the complete at-one-ment or atonement and perfect union of the body and soul with the divine spirit. In the first degree, they are separate to show the separation of the soul from the divine spirit and the absence of a complete union between the soul and the body. In the second degree, the separation of the first two knots, but the combination of the second and third indicates that a union between the soul and body has taken place to form a complete man by the study of the liberal arts and sciences, thus paving the way for a true knowledge of the great architect of the universe. And finally, in the third degree, the combination of the first and second knots and the separation of the third symbolizes the release of the soul from the body through the gates of death, and the combination of the soul with the divine spirit, thus leaving the base body aside. Now, brethren, in the Grand Lodge of India, in any Masonic lodge, we have always a minimum of 5 volumes of sacred law to reflect 5 major religions of India. For the Hindus, it is the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. For the Christians, it's the Holy Bible. For the Muslims, it's the Quran Sharif. For the Sikhs, it's the Guru Granth Sahib. And for the Zoroastrians, it's the Zenda-Vesta. And there are also sometimes when you have the Dhammapada for the Buddhists. So the question arises, why was the Srimad Bhagavad Gita appropriately chosen for the sake of those who follow the Hindu faith? So let me speak about the appropriateness of the Srimad Bhagavad Gita as a volume of sacred law. This book contains the teachings of Lord Krishna, whom Dr. Albert McKay described as the son of a virgin, whose spirit overshadowed her and incarnated itself and was taken and nursed in the sheepfold of Nanda. The teaching of the Gita is contained in the second discourse, where Lord Krishna teaches Arjuna, quote, that death is inevitable, that there is a soul which is unaffected by physical death, that dishonor is worse than death, and that perfect peace is liberation from the mortal coil and atonement with the divine spirit, unquote. Further, this verse is revealing, quote, men will recount thy perpetual dishonor, and to one highly esteemed, dishonor exceeded death. The analogy, my brethren, with the sentence in the 3rd degree, death has no terrors equal to the stain of falsehood and dishonor, is clear. It is a remarkable circumstance that this lesson, exactly parallel to the essential teachings in Freemasonry, is taught in what is known as 18 adhyayas, or by 18 steps. And if you recall your ceremony of initiation, passing, and raising in the craft, you were made to take 18 steps. How do I say 18? In the 1st degree, you took 3 steps from the west to the east to reach the altar. Then you are asked to take the first regular step in Freemasonry before you are entrusted with the secrets of that degree. Similarly, in the passing degree, you are asked to take 5 steps as a winding staircase leading to the altar. Then you took your second regular step to receive the entrustment of that degree. And finally, in the raising ceremony, you are asked to take 7 steps to the altar, followed by the 3rd regular step in Freemasonry. So if you add all this, 3 plus 1 plus 5 plus 1 plus 7 plus 1, you come to 18 steps. So the Srimad Bhagavad Gita is the 18th chapters in it, and we have to take 18 steps. And incidentally, there is a temple in southern India called Lord Ayappa Shrine in a place called Sabarimala. One needs to go through a penance to actually visit the temple. It's similar to what Muslims do when they take this penance in Ramadan, and also similarly Christians they observe Lent. So you have this purification of the mind and body before you actually go to a holy place. So similarly, this temple, you need to purify yourself for 40 days. And then only after you have done that are you allowed to actually climb these 18 golden steps leading to the temple. So the number 18, my brother, has got a lot of significance, both spiritually as well as Maçonically. Now, I want to proceed to what are the next item in this combination and parallel connections is the 3 lights. Another remarkable circumstance is the existence of the 3 lights in the lodge, which are located near the seats of the 3 principal officers in the east, south, and west. These lights, my brother, give not only light but also heat and correspond to the 3 fires in the Vedic ritual, which are the Ahavaniya, Dakshinagni, and Bharapatya, whose psychic centers in man are in the face, the heart, and the abdomen, as stated in the Garbhopanishad. This indicates the psychic centers in the human body are represented by the penal signs of the 3 degrees in the guttural, pectoral, and abdominal regions. In the Pragnihotra Upanishad, it is said that the Darshanagni stays in the heart, and the Koshatagni becomes Garapatya and stays in the navel. Now, the 4th and the supreme fire of the human body is known as the Surya Agni and is in the shape of a mandala or the disc with thousands of rays, and it stays in the Mardana or the crown of the head. The symbolism of the first 3 fires or lights correspond to the 3 degrees of Freemasonry, and their centers for their penal signs is manifest. But the 4th and supreme sign cannot be interpreted except for those who have passed the first principles chair in a Holy Royal Art chapter. I now move on to the 2 pillars. As regards the resemblance of the 2 pillars, we have only to look at the pillars erected at the entrance of many Hindu temples, and we can at once perceive their inner meaning by dint of Masonic light. The sacredness of the 3, 5, and 7 steps in certain Hindu ceremonies, especially in the old forgotten ceremony of Ashwamedha, where the officiating priest proceeded towards the Prabhupatya fire, placed in the northeast corner of the place, purified for the purpose, is also worth noting. Now, brethren, let us now take a look at the apron which Masons wear vis-a-vis the sacred thread. The close resemblance that exists between the wearing of the apron at and from the initiation into Freemasonry and the wearing of the sacred thread at the Upanayanam by the initiate into Brahmanism has been noticed by several Masonic scholars. But the study of the Yagnopavita in its relation to the Masonic apron, its passing over the 3 cyclical and Masonic center verses, namely the guttural, the pectoral, and abdominal region, is well worth a study by itself. Brethren, now let me move on to another concept, which is that of circumambulation. The practice of circumambulation in the lodge bears a close analogy to the practice of pradakshina, or turning on one's right hand, which is strictly observed in Hinduism in all ritualistic ceremonies and forms of worship, just as it bears an analogy to a similar practice in many other religions. Dr. Albert Mackay states that this religious rite, a Brahmin, after rising in the morning, adores the sun with his face to the east, then proceeds by way of the south to the west, exclaiming, quote, "I follow the course of the sun," unquote. In prayer, the Brahmin makes a center of himself and turns round his right hand, while in worship he does the same round the temple and God. The same rule is observed at the offering of the food to God and in various portions of the fire worship. Freemasonry is said to be based on the solar cult. The worshipful master representing the rising sun, the junior warden the meridian sun, and the senior warden the setting sun. Every Brahman on rising worships in the morning the rising sun in the east, at midday the meridian sun, and in the evening the setting sun, circumambulating in the proper manner on all 3 occasions. Once again, in the Kaushitaka Upanishad, the 2nd chapter, the following passage occurs, quote, "Now follow the 3 kinds of meditation prescribed by the all-conquering Kaushitaka. Having put on the sacrificial thread, rinse the mouth with a water cup thrice. One should adore the rising sun, saying, 'Thou art the destroyer of sin. Destroy my sin.' In the same manner, one should adore the sun when in the zenith, saying, 'Thou art the great destroyer of sin. Destroy my sin completely.' In the same manner, one should adore the setting sun, saying, 'Thou art the full destroyer of sin. Destroy my sin fully.' The worshipper thus destroys fully the sin that he commits by day and night. Thus I imitate my divine revolution. I follow the revolution of the sun, and with these incantations turns round his right. Now, brethren, I would like to spend a little time talking about the 3 degrees themselves, the signs of the 3 degrees. The signs of the 3 degrees also afford interesting analogies. The three penal signs of the 3 degrees allude to the 3 physical centers already referred to, namely the throat, the heart, and the navel. These 3 centers are connected to Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva once again. Brother Ward suggests that our signs have a striking analogy to the legend of the creation of man. 3 twice-born castes having come of Brahma's face, breast, and belly, and that the sign of the 1st degree suggests the cutting off of the 1st caste from those below. And Major Sanderson suggests that this sign was originally a mantra or a magic prayer which had to be most carefully guarded from the profane. Brother Ward states that the hailing sign of the 2nd degree is to be found made by Lord Hanuman, the picture coming up in the middle, in bringing the mountain with the elixir of life in his left hand, while with the right he wields a gavel. The sign of horror in the 3rd degree represents the incapacity of the human eye to see the ghastly wound still visible in the forehead of a master, which corresponds to the fire eye of Shiva on the forehead, while the sign of sympathy touches the same on the foreheads of the brethren. A study of the figures on the panels of the temples in Kanchipuram, in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu, very close to where I live, such as the Vaikuntha Perumal temple, the Kailashanatha temple, the Mukteshwara temple, Tripurantakeshwara temple, they all disclose the existence of the hailing sign of the 2nd degree. They also disclose the grand royal sign and other signs of the 3rd degree of the panel. These temples, my brethren, are several thousand years old. Now let us take a brief look at the penal sign, of the 3 degrees of the craft, representing, as I said earlier, the guttural, the pectoral, and the abdominal. These may be correlated to 3 of the chakras of the human body, namely the Vishuddha, which is the thyroid gland, the Anahata, which is the thymus gland, and the Manipura, which is the islets of Langerhans and the pancreas, and the adrenal glands. And these are respected. The reverential or hailing sign in the royal arch can, in a similar manner, be correlated to the Sahasra chakra, which is the pituitary gland. Thus, even the signs of the degrees refer to that part of the human body that may be considered the control point for exaltation of a mere mortal to a more developed soul. The American comparative religious scholar Joseph Campbell describes the concept of a kundalini as, quote, the figure of a coiled female serpent, a serpent goddess, not of gross but subtle substance, which is to be thought of as residing in a torpid, slumbering state in the subtle center. The first of the 7 near the base of the spine, the aim of the yoga then being to rouse the serpent, or lift her head and bring her up a subtle nerve or channel of the spine to the so-called 1,000-petal lotus, Sahasra, at the crown of the head. She, rising from the lowest to the highest lotus center, will pass through and wake the 5 between, and with each waking, the psychology and personality of the practitioner will be altogether and fundamentally transformed, unquote. Now, once again, take a closer look at the various penal signs in the first. In the 1st degree, we excite the throat, or the Vishuddha. In the 2nd degree, the heart, or the Anahata. And in the 3rd degree, the solar plexus, the royal arch, the crown, or the Mooladhara. Thus, we commence our journey from the top to the bottom, the Kundalini structure of intertwined serpents, reach the root or the Mooladhara, only to rise again until we reach the crown or Mooladhara, and thus get exalted into the presence of the everlasting God. Brethren, in India, we also have the caste of Masons. The actual caste of a sort of Masons exists in the Deccan area. The Deccan area is the central part of India. And they have a deity there. The deity is known as Vishwakarma, which translates into English as architect of the world. The ruins of the temple dedicated to him show all the symbols of Freemason. The entrance of the temple is always in the west, whereas there are 3 raised platforms in the east, south, and west. In the actual sanctum, the idol is placed in the east with a light burning before it, and some smaller deities in the south and west, respectively. The chief theory is to proceed from a very crude state to a perfect state. And this is done by depicting two blocks of stone, one purposefully kept in a crude state, while the other is made as smooth and polished as possible. Don't these remind you of the rough and perfect ashram? The walls are covered with various designs of implements of craftsmen, but the most marked one is the right angle. The caste marks also consist of a right angle. The members of this community were mostly workers in metal, blacksmiths, and masons, and they held the last day of the lunar month as sacred. We also find the double triangle as one of their sacred symbols depicting the three aspects of humanity, namely the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. They follow a certain method depicted by the Shard Chakra Veda, which very satisfactorily explains the cosmology and symbology of the circle, the triangle, and the square. Now, brethren, these masons belong to those professions I mentioned, and I'm sure you can draw a parallel to one of the persons mentioned as a password. Now, the symbols in Freemasonry are also afford an excellent and interesting parallel with Hindu symbols, and they deserve a serious study. The triangle, the square, the point within a circle, the swastika, all have their place in the Hindu Shastras. The triangle is a symbol of spirit, the square that of the earth. The significance of their juxtaposition is on the worshipful master's pedestal. The plumb rule and the level and the correspondence with the symbols of Vishnu and Shiva have already informed you. The symbolism of the two triangles, one with the point upwards superimposed on another with a base upwards, so prominent in Holy Royal Arch Masonry, as also the point within a circle, is very evident in the Sri Chakra of the Tantra Shastra. Major Woodruff thus describes a quote. It consists of 4 triangles with the vertex upward in intersection, all around a point or a bindu, which represents Shiva. And by his Mula Prakriti, the 9 triangles are formed. These 9 triangles are enclosed in a circle around which are 8 lotus petals, also in a circle, which is again encircled by 16 lotus petals, once again in a circle. The whole of this is then enclosed in 3 concentric circular lines. Thus, there are 3 lines, 3 circles, 9 triangles, and a point, the center of the circle. This corresponds, my brethren, with the 3 psychic centers in man, and which has already been noticed. Once again, Brother Woodruff states, the tantric system mentions 6. The lower end of the vertebral column, the navel, the heart, the throat, the face, and the eyebrows. Above all, on the crown, as I said, Sahasra Chakra, or the chakra of the 1,000 petals. At the serpent power, earth is pierced the first, water is pierced in the second, fire is pierced in the third, ether above it, and manas in the eyebrows. Finally, she enjoys perfect union with Paramashiva in the Sahasra, and again returns to the first, where she lies coiled in slumber when not rendered active. It is remarkable to observe that the earth, water, and fire are closely associated with Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and their emblems are the square, the plumb rule, and the level. They represent the worshipful master, the junior warden, and the senior warden. Shiva and Shakti, in their play, proceed to the various chakras, become juxtaposed in the Anahata and androgynes in the Vishuddha, and completely united in the Agnya. The deity, however, is considered as being in the Sahasra but reflected in the Agnya. Sun, the moon, and fire, they shed their rays only on the 6 centers but do not reach the shining abode of Bhuloka or Chidananda. The Gita Tattva says, quote, there does not shine the sun, nor the moon, nor the fire. By knowing it, man does not return. That is my supreme abode. Unquote. It is light itself, prakasha, for it is pure chit. It is the abode of Chidananda, which is consciousness bliss. By meditation there, Brahma knowledge arises, which is liberation from all the hierarchies of suffering. The remaining chakras also further trace the manifestations of Shiva and Shakti until a complete reunion is reached in the Sahasra, and everything terminates in a bindu or a point of infinite luster, which needs no light to see it, to realize which could be Chidananda or the consciousness. But then we can now say at this point, this Swaprakasha Bindu of Chidananda, that is the self-lustered point of consciousness bliss, is indicated in the lodge by the point within a circle. Thus is the world journey, the Prapancha Yatra, indicated. The Supreme Being, created by Brahma, preserved and protected by Vishnu, annihilated by Shiva, and resurrected by the divine Shakti, and gradually attaining atonement with the Supreme Being, who is at the center, self-lustered, all-pervading, without name and form, transcending all description, permanent and unchangeable. The I am that I am, the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last, who was and is and will ever remain one and the same from everlasting to everlasting. Brethren, I'm afraid I must pause here. The subject, as I said, is vast. The temptation is strong, though my knowledge is minuscule. I only pray that the distinguished brethren should carry on the study of the symbolism and esotery of Freemasonry in comparison with religious systems, initiative rites, and philosophical expositions of various countries. The Tantric work, above all the Upanishads, are particularly commendable. Of the Upanishads, Sir William Jones said, quote, it is impossible to read the Vedanta or the many fine compositions and illustrations of it without believing that Pythagoras and Plato derived their sublime theories from the same fountain with the sages of India. Unquote. Victor Cousin, the great French historian of philosophy, lecturing in 1828 in Paris to an audience of 2,000 gentlemen, said, quote, when we read with attention the poetical and philosophical monuments of the East, above all those of India, we discover there many a truth so profound that we are constrained to bend the knee before the philosophy of the East and to see in this cradle of the human race the native land of the highest philosophy. Friedrich Schlegel, the great German philosopher, said, quote, it cannot be denied that the East Indians possess a knowledge of the true God. All their writings are replete with sentiment and expressions, noble, clear, and severely grand, as deeply conceived and reverentially expressed as in any human language, in which men have spoken of their God. Even the loftiest philosophy of the Europeans, the idealism of reason, as it set forth by Greek philosophers, appears in comparison with the abundant light and vigor of Oriental idealism, like a feeble Promethean spark in the full blood of the heavenly glory of the noonday sun. The divine origin of man is continually inculcated in the Vedanta philosophy to stimulate his efforts to return, to animate him in the struggle and incite him to consider a reunion and a reincorporation with divinity as the one primary object of every action and exertion. Schopenhauer said, quote, "In the whole world, there is no study as beneficial and as elevating as that of the Upanishads. It has been the solace of my life. It will be the solace of my death." Quote. Max Muller added, quote, "If philosophy is meant to be a preparation for a happy death or euthanasia, I know a better preparation for that than the Vedanta philosophy." Brethren, a system of philosophy which prepares men and teaches them how to die must afford a great analogy to Freemasonry and deserves the most careful of all free studies. Now, brethren, here, if you remember, the entire allegory of King Solomon's temple, by building of it by King Solomon, wherein God would reside, could be interpreted as we, in our quest to make ourselves better day by day to a better person, so good do we become over a period of time by the exercise of all these wonderful ideas and concepts of Freemason, that divinity itself can reside in us. That is our goal. Nothing can be grander than the ritual of Freemasonry, which symbolically teaches the same great lesson, and it has been truly described by Major Powell as, quote, "The stately old world phrases, the dignity and harmony of movement, of color and of euphony, satisfy the senses and minds of men, wearied by the stress and distraction of worldly affairs. This broad homily, philosophy of life, the simple declaration of brotherhood, the ethic of fidelity and friendship, truth without dogma, religion without sect, reverence without sacrifice of dignity, love without sentimentalism, all make the appeal of Freemasonry the most acceptable." Unquote. In conclusion, my brethren, I submit that I put together some of the ideas that I've gathered in the course of my limited study, merely to illustrate the vast scope of study and research, and I hope that the brethren would carry on Masonic study in all its aspects. Brother Wilmhurst quoted the following Hindu prayer as representing Freemasons' appeal to God. It goes like this: "Asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amrutam gamaya, Om Shanti Shanti Shanti." Translated into English, it reads, "From the unreal lead us to the real, from darkness lead us unto light, from death lead us to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace." So mote it be, my brother. Thank you, my brother. These are my references coming up.